Okay, so welcome to Small Things Brought Together. My name is Robin Love, and this is an ongoing video series of conversations with artists and others about creative process. We talk in a long format, meaning that we give ourselves time. So we have time to go deep and to be silent, to get a little lost and circle back and see what happens as we discuss the creative process and what that means for each of our guests. So today I'm very excited because we're entering some new territory, which is I'm speaking with Matthew Hills. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
Matthew is the director and curator of the Grenfell Art Gallery, which is on the Grenfell campus of Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador in Corner Brook on the west coast of Newfoundland, about 25 kilometers away from me as we speak. So Matthew is, as I said, a curator rather than a visual artist. So we're going to kind of get the other side of the story in a certain way, you could say. And it's my great pleasure to have Matthew as an artist who's worked with you, Matthew, and had, I think this an idea to bring you on really comes out of our work together and my experience of working with you as a curator. You also have a very interesting background and experience curating and working with artists across Canada. So by way of introduction, maybe is there something that you want to share as what's important to know about you and your background? And welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Appreciate the space because I think that's something for me to keep in mind is I tend to think slowly or to fumble with my articulations to sort of like find my words slowly. So I appreciate that there's a lot of time and space here. And I've always really valued our conversations, Robin. So I'm happy that we're getting a chance to do it and record it in a public way. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that discussion or this discussion. I don't know what else to say. Just, I think partially I'm excited that we're discussing creative process. And I do think of curatorial processes and curatorial practices as overlapping artistic processes, but as distinct and having their own ethical imperatives and ways of working in relationship to artistic practices and creative processes that are, I think, important to good curatorial work or good curatorial process and practice, and extend or reinforce or resonate creative processes for artists and borrow or trade on those things too. So yeah, that's maybe the only thing I'd add. Yeah.
Yeah, that's thank you for saying that. For me, when I was thinking about this conversation, a couple things came up, and maybe this is a place to kind of start the whole conversation, and it will bring in some of your past projects and your current work at Grenfell. And one is we were having our conversation and we were talking about an artist who also organizes exhibitions, and I called them a curator, and you actually got a little upset at me. So I've thought about that quite a bit because a lot of artists, myself included, have organized the exhibitions and kind of freely tossed that term around. And so I was so interested that you kind of drew a line there. And even just in your little intro that you just gave about like kind of the ethical imperatives around curating. And I feel like that's maybe part of what you were bristling a little at, if I can use that description. So I'd love to hear more if you're willing. And maybe I'll just toss out the other topic that's kind of been at my forefront in thinking about you and your work, which is really about care. Like the word that comes to my mind is care, in terms of like how I felt working with you. I felt very cared for. And I think about your role as a father of many children. Like
Oh,
you're
Robin, I watched Erin Hunt's and she got verklempt, so I'm already starting to, these are important things to me. Yes, you're talking my love language. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really feel like, you know, having witnessed you in your role as the dad, and you know, and just seeing the love that you have in that role, and kind of feeling like that this particular, not that you're like fatherly necessarily to artists, but like there's a caring that you extend to artists, and that personally, yeah, I have been on the receiving end very, you know, gratefully. Yeah.
I think that's really what I was anticipating bringing up. Like etymologically, the role of curator, if you look back at that word, it's one of care. Originally, that started in a deeply sort of colonial way with curating and care for objects, of curios, of strange things, often perceived as exotic or foreign and rare in a European colonial context. But for me, curatorial work is a care for artists, a care for community, a care for your collection, and it comes out of principles around that kind of care and support. My background, my grad studies, and really the community I feel like I came up in was Vancouver and UBC. And that's a community with I feel that that's a very rigorous community with strong commitment to artistic practices and rigorous artistic practices, particularly in the way that it's intellectualized and conceptualized. And it comes from it draws on particular traditions, some European, some coming from the Pacific Rim. I'm thinking of the Düsseldorf School and photography in particular, and photoconceptualism in Vancouver. But that sort of rigor and approach to historicizing and understanding curatorial practices and artists and artist work extends into some of the philosophies or ethos of curating and that care for community and maintenance. So those things, not maintenance, that's the wrong word, but sort of maintaining or cultivating, stewardship, I think is a model I've come to understand better. And I think, and these things are open. They're like artistic practices. They grow and shift and change. And I think that's fundamental to keep in mind and understand, so that these things are responsive. And I've kind of, I think artists can be curators and do incredible and fantastic work. But I think in terms of exhibition or in terms of creating things, I think that is a distinct and different role from being an artist. And when they take those things on, they are interesting and expand and push these things. But when those things fail, it's because there's a collision or some of the trespasses or ways that care is let down aren't true to what curatorial practice is, I think, in my mind.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and you said a word that like maybe extends out of the idea of care. I love that care and curating they're like have the same root. I did not know that. And I was thinking, like you said, nurturing. And so that is such a beautiful word. And yeah, I'd love to hear you say more about, in particular, that idea around curating. Like,
yeah, I find that really, I find like ecosystems and thinking about things as nurturing or natural or cultivating these things as important to helping people understand. Or I think there's a way in which, particularly in Canada, visual arts and contemporary art in particular is not valued as highly as it could be. Or I think it varies across the country, and it's a cultural thing. But I think it's certainly the case in Newfoundland that there's not, and particularly in Western Newfoundland. Actually, that's not true. Not particularly in Western Newfoundland. I think it's more common on the eastern side of the province. But there's a lack of understanding for what an artist does and the contributions, important societal and social contributions that an artist makes in working, in thinking, and really it's the seeds of consciousness in a society. It's the seeds of responsibility. It's the seeds of innovation and dynamism and just a sort of collective and communal understanding of what we're doing, living together in community. So I think artists are so at the heart of that. And when I think they need, a lot of things come up for me in that the role of an artist isn't always valorized or maintained and supported in the same ways, given the amount of social benefit. And if you want to be crass, even economic benefit that an artist contributes to culture and society. And I think good arts organizations, good visual arts, good cultural organizations, good galleries, whatever, biennials, whatever organization you're talking about, if they are visual arts, they center an artist's work and an artist's visions and the ways of working in contemporary art that are so generative and powerful and important. I think oftentimes in Canada, I often feel, and I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on that, is that visual arts is the lowest rung on the cultural sort of ladder and not always seen for its contributions and the innovations and the amount of powerful, important work it does. We're at a moment in this country where we're going through processes of truth and reconciliation and reckoning with a colonial history and the foundation of what we call Canada, a country called Canada, being in genocide, essentially, or not essentially genocide, cultural genocide. So I think contemporary artists, and especially obviously Indigenous artists, have been leading for decades that conversation, and only now in this is an example, and only now in contemporary society are we starting to process and deal with that. But someone like James Luna or Rebecca Belmore have been thinking through and working, and their predecessors have been thinking through and working through those ideas, and only now are they starting to be processed into the mainstream. I only mention that as an example of the work that artists do in our community or in our province or whatever scale you want to look at, that contemporary art and artists like yourself who are working in that way expand and do these seeds and ways of thinking. And I think also, just to wrap that up, it's what I really find exciting about working in a university gallery context. You get a chance to work with grad students and students who keep you on your toes and keep you fresh because they're looking and thinking about ideas or things that just that are ahead of our time, that are coming, and that we need to be aware of. So that's so fresh and dynamic and amazing. So,
yeah. I mean, you just said a lot. That's a lot right there.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, just quickly, like I remember back in the old days, maybe in the 90s, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs doing this thing that required all arts organization to keep track of the economics around their programming, which down to like people taking the subway to come, or hiring a cab, or going to a restaurant afterwards, or and sort of like doing all this stuff and realizing like for every dollar spent on cultural programming, there's like $100 in this was like in the 90s. It got so ridiculous that they stopped doing it because it was just kind of like absurd in fact. So the economics are absolutely. And artists are the coal mine canaries. They're the ones.
And like, even as we start to use that language, I feel like in my role I have two hats. One is arts administrator and curatorial, and there's a way in which, to me, that language, whether it's a notion of spillover economics, the cultural benefits of artistic activity, or any sort of, there's a way in which arts administrators, or as a director, you have to use that language to get grants. But in certain ways, it essentializes the benefit or what an artist is doing, because a lot of people can't understand it. But for me, I think what I find scary, or one of the things I want to remain conscious about, is that really becomes neoliberalism. That what we're dealing with now is an extension, this sort of essentialization of artists or art practices to be deployed in certain contexts that are politically, socially, culturally convenient. So when I use that language, I don't know, even as I'm talking through it with grad students or thinking about a career, how one works as an arts administrator, that you have to be conscious of not total corruption or of going too far down that road and thinking in those ways, because you lose the thread, and you lose, I think, what makes this what makes contemporary art or curatorial work or realizing projects in a space or outside of a space magic and important and special. So that's my
Yeah.
one advisor on that language. Sorry.
Yeah, totally. Oh my God, totally. Thank you for bringing that up. Completely. Yeah. And, I feel like it's a conversation I have with my artist friends all the time around, what are we doing, in terms of, the reality of I need to make money
Yeah.
and how am I doing this? And then if we are making money sounds even incorrect, like actually funding our art projects
Yeah.
appropriately,
Living. Yeah. Existing.
living in
Yeah.
a way,
Yeah.
it's like, and then how does that, like, then what kind of push and pull does that have on actually making the work? And this whole thing of people who just are like, forget it, I don't want any part of the economic piece. And then artists who are kind of paint themselves into a corner where they feel like they can't produce anything new because the thing they were doing is the thing they're known for, etc. Yeah. So it's in. So just to sort of bring it back to you,
Okay. Yep.
personally,
I'll try and avoid this. Yeah. Sorry.
I feel like, well, I also feel like, my background is in the US primarily. Most of my adult life has been an artist in the US, and I'm a new immigrant to Canada, relatively speaking. And so finding my way in the Canadian art scene and kind of always being surprised that Canadian artists feel very underfunded, which to me feels like, are you kidding? Actually, super generous, but that's really just like the pathetic world in the US. But to say I've watched how your care and nurturing of artists, certainly in Newfoundland, in your capacity in Western Newfoundland, to pull, to kind of give people permission not to worry about that other piece, and then to like take a step that otherwise might feel risky or but I guess I want to say, like, I'll just now speak from my own experience, which is in a moment where I was feeling very just like, as one does in the middle of a project or an installation that feels all consuming, and you're in your little I'm in my little universe, and you would just say something that's like so clear and simple, and it would be like, oh, right. And like a real pivot to be like, oh, right, clarity is over here, and all of that, mishigosh is over there. So to me, that's the care, that's the nurture, that I see the potential of and have experienced.
Thank you. Yeah, that's lovely to say. Yeah.
And I've seen you work with other artists, and I know that you've done it for them as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, your generosity around support, like with applications and recommendations, so important.
That support you speaking of you independently deserve, but that's support that should be in place for artists in our community, and I think is increasingly. But I think that's one of the roles of the Grenfell Art Gallery, which is Memorial University Art Gallery, to be callous to that, to support professional practices, and to be I don't know, like one of the ways I may be moving away from the idea of progressivism or some sort of great arc towards something. Like I talk about building capacity, and maybe that's just an extension of my neoliberal language, but I'm not entirely sure what the end goal is, but making sure that artists have that support on an ongoing basis to achieve what they want to do with their work and contribute in the community in those ways. Yeah.
So can I ask you, this is something that I think about a lot, which as an artist in Newfoundland, and sort of relates back to what you're just saying, which is, treading a line between doing something, offering something, for, in your case, presenting exhibitions that the community will feel encouraged or can relate to. You know, Grenfell campus is up literally on the top of a hill, you know, and
Yeah.
overlooking the city. And there's a real physical and I think existential gap
Yeah.
between the town and the university,
Yeah.
and getting people up the hill to a place that makes them feel uncomfortable for the most part.
Yeah.
A lot of people, not everyone, of course.
Yeah.
And so you have to literally like draw people up the hill and
Yeah.
lure them, you know, up the hill. And if they feel too out of their element, they're not coming. So this is the great question of like how to not be caught in the just trying to please and be nice.
Yeah.
and
Right.
really giving artists space to like be out there, like at the forefront, as you said, you know.
Yeah.
And so how do you navigate that very tricky edge of the sword?
Yeah. Not to come back to the following thing, but I think children are the key, whether that's school programs or just getting children into the space. I think there's a couple things, even in what you said about Canada. I think there's also a degree to be removed to understand in Newfoundland some of its history, its relationship, it being an island, the province, it being formerly a republic. Those sorts of that's even another degree of removal for me as well in the context of our artistic community. And then you look at colonial histories in our province and the ways that we work in the centralization of administration, power, and seats of power in one center in St. John's. Those things compound and layer onto perceptions of accessibility, notions of, you know, what a university does in the community or what an art gallery does, or what I maybe just to think abstractly about what institutions are doing for the public and people. So I think one of the ways that the gallery, or I want my curatorial practice to be working as director of the Grenfell Art Gallery, is we want to get outside those gallery walls, or not only outside those gallery walls, but when we bring people into the space, it's through programs like Artists in Residence, art camps, school programs. It's bringing practices in our community or to our community that resonate with those interests and will draw people up. I think Memorial is unique in the sense that there is a mission, not unique, but it is fundamentally committed to the well-being of the province. So I do always appreciate that as a university, when I seek support from the gallery seeks support for these initiatives, the university is in support of that. We're in a really, I falter a little bit my language around that. We're in an acute moment of tension because there's a labor action currently. MUNFA, the faculty union at Memorial, is in the midst of a strike and labor action, which is addressing. We're also in a moment of where our provincial government's pursuing an austerity budget, which those things are not unrelated. It's not discussed much. It's becoming sort of entrenched sides between senior admin at the university and MUNFA, but there's also the larger picture that we're in a province that's pursuing, I think, an austerity budget. And as we transition away from oil and gas and exploitive models of economics and hopefully towards more sustainable models, they're also cutting education and locking out in certain ways, contributing to the lockout of some of the engines of innovation and thinking. So I went off on a tangent to try and draw attention to that, but I think so. Those are some of the ways. I think fundamentally, if we can get kids in the space, their reactions and interactions with art, like, it's powerful. And I think one of my mentors would always say, art isn't for everyone, but it is for anyone. Like, not everyone's going to love it, but anyone can. And when you see some kids in the space or a school and class program, there are without fail always these bright eyes, bright lights, a reaction or a depth of understanding in something that'll shift my perception of a work, but also just speaks to a sort of alchemy of what visual arts can do on a primary. It's complex, but yeah, those sorts of things are ways in which I think about breaking down those barriers. And I also think, to go back to what you were saying about artistic project, artists working or sustaining, we can't divorce ourselves from the means of production. I think we want to be like, even in Corner Brook, we're looking at hill and mill. I think one of the things we try to do is, for instance, using paper produced at the Corner Brook pulp and paper mill in our publications and the ways that we work, and thinking about those relationships. And I think, I don't know, when I think about those, I think our other artists it's artists in our community that have led the way around those things. I think about Call Out Urban. I think about Marlene McCallum and her history of town site, and the relationship of the mill to some of the architecture and what that means culturally and socially in our communities. So those are strategies or ways of thinking about that issue, which is real for people. And I think really crystallized in some of this labor action, some of the tension. Even as MUMFA pushes populist buttons like Fogo Islands and other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that's too in the weeds. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's, well, for just sort of in a general way, I think it's very interesting, because it just shows how you can't, pull one thread without pulling all of them.
Yeah.
And especially in your role, and I was thinking about, you are like, in some ways, like, you have so many intersecting and maybe even conflicting, needs and concerns, and people telling you what to do and asking you what to do. And, so you're like in a very unique place in this very, you pointed out, like, Newfoundland is just kind of such a place unto itself, that in some ways, talking about Canadian art, it's like, doesn't necessarily always include what's happening in Newfoundland.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And to some degree, even Atlantic Canada. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, yeah. There's always a part of me that wonders if I've sought that out, or that sort of dynamic of feeling marginalized or feeling outside of it is something that I find fuel in, or find comfort and safety in. So, yeah. Maybe it's self-perpetuating.
The island of people who feel that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny you say that, because I have that line of questioning myself on the regular. So.
As we should, right? Self-examination.
Yeah. But, it's just funny that, and yet here we are on this island.
Yeah. And I'm thankful for it. Yeah. I'm happy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so maybe this is a good segue into the Bonavista Biennale.
Yes.
So you are two-time co-curator of that event. And maybe you could just share a little bit, like, what is the Bonavista Biennale? Well,
the Bonavista Biennale was founded by Catherine Baudet, coming out of Two Rooms Contemporary Art. That's a somewhat controversial statement when I say that. It was founded by Catherine Baudet and Two Rooms Contemporary, had sort of, planted the seeds for it, had an ongoing residency at Dunterra on the Bonavista Peninsula. The Bonavista Peninsula in and of itself is a fascinating sort of microcosm or crystallization of some of the sort of cultural, social milieu of Newfoundland. It's the area that is, I say historically, but there's no firm confirmation, but it's the commonly in mainstream media or mainstream history attributed as the place where Cabot made landfall. It's also, where the encounter with Indigenous people would have first happened in that way. I mean, even that is obscured, as you may know. Some of our curatorial work became contentious in the context that there was such an erasure of Indigenous presence in that community that some people denied that there was ever Indigenous peoples there, which is a preposterous proposition. But there you go. So back to what the biennial is. Sorry. So Bonavista is a peninsula on the sort of northeastern side of the island. It's a group of outport fishing communities along this peninsula, around this peninsula, and the biennial is a contemporary art event, happens every 2 years, that places contemporary art either in public spaces, heritage spaces, interventions in public spaces, and usually 22 projects, 20 to 25 different projects around the peninsula, moving people through those spaces with contemporary art. It happens August to September, which is the prime summer in Newfoundland. And the other thing is Bonavista is incredibly beautiful. It comes by that name. Honestly, the vistas, the rocks, you also feel the power of the North Atlantic in a way that there's only certain parts of the province. And that is you see that in your work, the way that water and the ocean has shaped this province and that relationship to nature. And that's really, to me, front and center, more urgent in certain ways in Bonavista on a daily basis. Like, you get gale force winds on the regular there, though. Yeah. The cod moratorium had a huge impact on the peninsula. So there's just the ways in which another thing, the tour, it's also a fascinating peninsula is also like crystallized a lot of economic aspects, or it's really sought tourism as an economic generator, as well as real estate development. The New York Times did a story on the Bonavista as a town is a great place to live, and they've invested in some of their heritage housing, and there's a lot of real estate speculation, or was. I don't know if that's still the case in that community. So it's a fantastic event. Happens every 2 years. I co-curated it, one iteration with Catherine Baudet and David Divney from the AGNS, and did the most recent iteration during the COVID with Pat Grattan, who had also done the original biennial with Catherine. It is very much a community, or it's transitioning right now. It has a new fantastic artistic director, Rose, but it started out as very much a community initiative with a bunch of like-minded, really hyper-capable volunteers at the table, including Sarah Agnew and Kaloran McRae, who did a lot of the administrative support and project support for it, and have since moved on. But there's so much goodwill and good people in that community doing it, whether it's Union House Arts and Jane Walker, Mark Ryle, just the people on that peninsula. And I think a lot of it is they're artists, and they're people who have believe in the power of contemporary art, and just who have some from across the country who have summer homes in Newfoundland and come back in the summer. And just it's a wonderful, important event in our provincial scene, but it also has a national and international platform. And some of the ways that it's working, whether also in sort of the biennial format, but presenting projects outside of traditional gallery spaces, are just curatorially fascinating, and some of that resonant and redolent history that's on the peninsula. It goes so, like, even if you're looking at some of the political histories on the island, and Port Union is a union town started by Coker. Like, it's just so many layers. It's incredible. Yeah. So that's that event, and I'll send the link, because you can't capture us without images. Sorry.
Yeah. And I think I love your excitement that you're still after two versions of it. You're still super excited by it.
I like, in some ways, I miss the work, because it just lets you think and work in these, as you know, when we work together, or you work more directly with Pat, but in these ambitious and big ways that we don't always get to think and work like. I find that really exciting. And also, to be honest, I'm recovering from the burnout of doing it 2 straight years. It really, without hyperbole, I was burnt out and really fed up and done. And I stepped away, and I've spent a bit of this winter, or the beginning of this winter, taking out from burnout and sort of recovering. So I am surprised that I have that kind of enthusiasm with it. But I think it's also being in conversation with you about it. I feel like some of my best curatorial work was in realizing those biennials, and some of the work that came out of it, I think, was powerful and important. I'm thinking particularly of Camille Turner's Afronautic Research Lab, and thinking about the Black Atlantic and Newfoundland's role in the slave trade and shipbuilding on Bonavista. There's a lot of other projects that are really I think, powerful and important, including yours, that draw attention to obscured histories and obscured labor and important social and cultural issues in our province, that have been put front and center by contemporary art, and, you know, platformed and broadened. And because Bonavista is a really desirable, I think, tourist destination, has a proximity to St. John's where people can commute easily, it means that there was more of a national and international audience for that event that we don't always receive in Western Newfoundland yet. I think that could come with time, but I do get excited about it. Yeah, it's a fantastic event. And I'd encourage anyone listening or watching to come out to the next iteration, because I'm sure it'll be fantastic as well. And there's a lot of cool contemporary art things that happen in our province. You could make a circuit of it if you were coming for a period of time, but Bonavista for me is front and center in that, for sure. The biennial.
Yeah. And I think that event has so successfully tread that sword's edge, you know, presenting stuff that is really, really urgent and right now, and even before right now, like, you know, ahead of its time. And the community support is like powerful, and it's really like done a great job. To my experience anyway, is that people really own it as a community, as a peninsula. There's a sense of like, it doesn't feel that kind of uncomfortable us and them thing going on. It feels very much like, yeah, we're all in it together. And the artwork is not compromising. Yeah.
And like that aspect of community engage or community embrace is like, it predates my involvement with it. It's so fundamental to it. Like the site invigilators or the site docents or the site interpreters, they call them, on the ground, are from the community and often have a way of speaking or relating to people who are visiting about those projects that cut through the curatorial bullshit in certain ways that make it, people have that buy-in and people have that belief or connection to it in that way. It is very special because, so I think in the last year, the gallery had pursued the Corner Brook Public Art Initiative with two partners, the City of Corner Brook and the Rotary Arts Center, Tina Dolter Gallery. And we had presented 3 projects around the city, one of which was Gerald Belew's Crow, Rubber Hits the Road, which is a 15 foot, I think it's 5-ton crow made from repurposed tires or salvage reclaimed tires. And it's a beautiful sculpture. It's really fascinating. Crows as a sentinel species, and also their cultural connections and what they mean. But that piece was very controversial. Partially could have been our placement in relation to the Corner Brook sign, which was something that the city of Corner Brook had suggested, was very controversial in Corner Brook. It drew it was a dead crow, undesirable reaction. That wasn't the case in Bonavista. It was like really widely embraced and celebrated, and perhaps that's placement, curatorial decisions. But I think for me, I was surprised at some of the discourse around it. I think that was somewhat to do with the fact that it started on Facebook. But I just think that underscores that how, for lack of a better term, progressive those communities are in their embrace and understanding of contemporary art practices. So, and I don't know, maybe that has a lot to do with the work of Catherine and others on that peninsula. I'm thinking of, in doing that, Susan Shirk, Margaret among them. So,
it is really interesting to think about. Well, it's something certainly I think about all the time, you know? And it's like, what is it? Just feels quite like mysterious, actually. And the trust factor, you know? Somehow in Bonavista that there's been cultivated for whatever reasons, like just enormous trust.
Yeah, there have been instances where that hasn't been realized, like that came up, but for me on a curatorial basis, but it's the exception. Like that, that trust is there for sure, absolutely. And I think in understanding the first iteration or doing my research, some of that was built in the first iteration. There was a responsiveness to some of the concerns of community in realizing this project. One one of the like landmark projects of the initial, I'm thinking of Reinhardt's piece, I can't think of the name, was going to cut across a key ATV trail for that community, and they moved the project. So that kind of like consultation or responsiveness,
Yeah.
and that those were very informal and only a Newfoundland way, like, you know, yeah, that these things happen really is lays the groundwork for that kind of resonance or buy-in, I think. So that's really kudos to Catherine and the original organizers for those starting those relationships, which I include Jane Walker among those. That, yeah, the work of Union House and artists on the peninsula and who are in those communities for kind of expanding the understanding and being a community already in principled ways to build off of that and build that trust, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when it's broken down, it's been more about political issues or municipal politics, to my mind. So yeah.
Yeah, which is also just like to be expected. It's not.
Yes. Yeah. Totally. Especially something on that scale and that ambition to be totally is part of making the sausage. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your experience, you know, when I was looking at one of your earliest projects that you did right out of grad school, a retrospective of a Chinese artist that received quite a bit of criticism, and in fact had to be ostensibly, well, not removed, but like altered
Yes.
because of public outcry.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that? And I mean,
Sure.
has that informed you? That was like one of your first projects.
Yeah,
so
it was.
like,
I forward that as a formative
your
one.
feet were on the fire.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was an assistant curator and coordinating curator. It was a project, Wan Young Ping's House of Oracles, that was coming from the Walker Art Center in Minnesota, which to my mind is a leading contemporary art institution in North America. And this Wan Young Ping was an artist who left China after Tiananmen Square and moved to Paris and had a practice. He's since sadly passed away, but had a practice leading contemporary art and thinking through issues of cultural exchange and difference and dissent. And he had a piece entitled Theater of the World, which was drew on insects from the Chinese zodiac, Chinese significant cultural insects and cultural reference points, including scorpions, tarantulas, spiders. And the piece was called Theater of the World. It essentially put these species in a panopticon of bugs in this space over the duration of the exhibition. It was essentially it appeared to be a turtle shell. It was a contained space where these insects lived.
I have an image. Maybe I'll.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Because it's. Yeah, when I looked it up, it was like, oh, it makes so much more sense.
Okay, yes, that's just great. Yes, yeah.
This is at the Guggenheim, so clearly, after your big controversial thing, it still held some power for people.
Oh, but like that had our controversy. First of all, the shutting down of this piece was the only iteration of this piece being closed at the presentation. This exhibition toured. So Theater of the World is at the center. That turtle piece and bridge goes over, and this is a really common form in Wan Young Ping's work, that both the turtle form and that larger bridge form over and that sort of movement in his piece. And these are like he has this whole array of concerns and investigations and work, this body of work that is powerful and amazing. And then in the public reaction to this work, it became issues of animal. It was the SPCA that came in and shut down this piece for non-Canadian viewers, the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Of course, I'm sorry, that's probably universal. But because these species, it was inevitable that some of these insects were going to die. There was or would be fed upon.
Actually,
yeah,
right?
yes,
like
yes.
They're going to battle.
Yes, they will battle, or some will become dominant. And the piece is called Theater of the World. They each, you can see around there that those trays, each of the species, each of the insects is given a particular tray in space, and then they emerge out into the center and interact or fight or do whatever. And through, so the duration of this piece and the realization is what's key. And the piece was shut down almost immediately. And for working with Wan Ying Ping and speaking, one of the reasons they had left, well, for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons they had decided to move to France and to Paris in particular, I came to understand after this event, was that the way that the artist's voice was celebrated and valorized in French society, and understood that the artist is a key figure to equitable, fair, cultural, to the social contract in a certain way. And that he's quoted in the article I sent you, he just felt like this was a form of cultural imperialism and a total lack of understanding of his work, or even Chinese culture and Chinese society in some of the ways in which this was being closed without sort of thought or without conversation. And it was quite controversial because it drew on past examples of animal cruelty in the community. I'm thinking of one very horrible grad project that came out of Emily Carr, and that the SBCA had shut down as well. Yeah, I think even in preparing that piece, it's something we'd anticipated and sort of gone through the proper steps. And it was one of the ways in which, including consulting experts in that field, and one of the ways that the SPCA was aware of it in advance and was preparing.
So they had already, you had already kind of said like, hey, we're doing this.
Oh, yeah, this is happening.
And they were kind of like, oh, really?
Yes. And waited till the right time to shut it down. Right. So,
ouch. Yeah.
It was great in a certain way. Like, that's a really fascinating conversation. And like, great, fine. But like,
yeah.
In other ways, an artist was censored. That's horrible. Right. So at least some of the questions or ideas that's coming up out of that event, like, draws more attention to the ideas in a certain way, but not in a way that respected what the artist was doing and working. I mean, I think, in so many ways that he works. Or the other show, I had interned on the Brian Youngin show at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and that had turned into this curatorial assistant position, or the assistant curator position. And just both of them work in these big, interesting ways. And it's just like, it was very exciting because the Vancouver Art Gallery is fantastic, big space, really ambitious. So just to be working with those kind of artists and thinking about things that I felt were culturally and socially relevant and important was, so that's that piece.
I can really see how it shapes this idea that artists are like the ones, well, I mean, it's hardly a new thought, but like, are kind of at the front of showing us all how we actually are. And sometimes that's too much for us to bear.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Exactly. Yes, absolutely. That project was curated by Philippe Vernier, and assistant curator was Dorian Chang. Yeah, but I was the assistant curator who was coordinating the iteration at the Vancouver Art Gallery once they came in and working very with Wan Ying Ping, who was just such a gentleman and so generous with a
that's great
young assistant curator. Yeah, I was really fortunate.
Maybe I'll just, since I have it up, I think I can just, so this is a project that you also worked on.
This was a project with an artist named Fedora Ramita, Toronto-based project. It was coming out of a residency they'd done at Banff, the Banff Center, and we presented it at the Agnes Etherington Art Center, which was my first sort of job after my position at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Okay, so we're speaking of MUMFA. That position at the Vancouver Art Gallery was always short-term contracts. So I'd be flipped over to another short-term contract, and there was no sort of stability or benefits associated with it. My partner at the time had gone home gone back to Ontario to be a to provide care for their mother who was going through the early onset Alzheimer's. So they were at home, and there was a level of stability in the University Art Gallery and applying to the Agnes Etherington Art Center in Kingston in Ontario. So I had taken that administrative job, but part of the understanding in taking that on, that the administrative coordinator role, was that I could do some small curatorial projects or work with the curator there, Jan Allen, who's really fantastic, and Janet Brooke, who was the director and chief curator on some smaller projects. And one of them was this Fedora Ramita's To Whom It May Concern that we installed in 5 different rooms in Agnes Etherington's historic home, which is the seed of the larger gallery. So the exhibition was called To Whom It May Concern in 5 rooms, and had these 5 separate video pieces. Started like looking back at this project, like kind of early internet. It's interesting space.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So the project is really that people are reading love letters that were culled from the internet, but they've never seen them before. So they're just kind of very spontaneously reading them, right? There's not, like, they haven't rehearsed. They're not actors. They're just sat down and here, read this.
And their sort of self-consciousness or the cringe aspects of it are so up front and central. It's great. Yeah, I love those pieces. Yeah. Also, the way the videos.
Well, unfortunately, there's not there's no photos from the installation, so I didn't know that you installed it like kind of in a domestic setting.
And throughout. So part of it was that it was a historic home, and Queen's, which is a big university, treats that historic heritage space in a certain way. And we were, as an institution, really interested in breaking down some of the formalities or pretensions in that, in both the gallery space and the notion of a heritage home. Agnes Etherington was this radical, powerful, fantastic woman, and had started the art gallery in Kingston, in that community. And just like had style and land, and her home was being treated as sort of like as a sort of, in the ways that heritage spaces can sometimes be treated as sacred or sacrosanct, and just wanting to keep things intact and in space. And someone as radical as Agnes Etherington would want contemporary art, would want artists, especially someone like Fedora Ramita, emerging female conceptual artist, to have space, and we wanted to activate the house in that way. So that was one of I love that project, and Fedora is really a fantastic artist. So having the chance to work with her early on was really wonderful.
Yeah, I love that. So so I called up the Biennale website, and you can go over. We can see kind of.
The other thing that Biennial does that I didn't mention is they do catalog. They always have both a digital catalog and publish something, and it's all sort of integrated into the Biennial. Like that comes out of once the Biennial is realized, the catalog, and I think that's really also, I don't know, that there's an ongoing tangible document or legacy is really fantastic.
And and certainly, like, for the artists, it's really wonderful to have professional photographers documenting your work, and to have people writing an essay that's speaking about it, even to have the text on site that is written kind of in collaboration with the artist, but just I know from my experience and my artist friends, just to have another particular kind of eyes looking at your work and then writing about it is so special.
I think that's another thing that really excites me about the Biennial. In its mission and mandate is curatorial practice, curatorial excellence. Like, it believes in the work of curators. Like, I think that predates me, or came from Catherine or Pat, but it has that at its center, which I think is, I don't know, fantastic. For me, that's very self-serving in me saying that, but I do think it's wonderful.
Well,
that's project,
Newfoundland and Labrador. We haven't even mentioned the word Labrador, but because that's feels like a whole other thing. But there's just not. It's just a small place, a small population. There's just like a limited number of venues available, and so that's just the reality. And so that this thing grew up out of the land, essentially, and the communities. and is offering this level of engagement with the community and with the artists and with the curators. It's just so valuable. It's so valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, like you have Will Gill's most recent project from the last iteration, but his green chair project in the first iteration, like even
Yeah.
as I say that, you know, it's curatorial centered, like the fact Will's project really is the recipe for success of the biennial. Like in the ways that he worked it and achieved it, I mean, that's why the biennial works, because that's a that's a that's a standard kitchen chair from a Newfoundland table in Elliston, which is the root cellar capital of Newfoundland and Labrador. And so that the women in that community following the cod moratorium sat around kitchen tables trying to figure out, how are we going to save our community? What is going to be the catalytic thing that can keep us together and keep us moving forward? And it was preserving and thinking about root cellars, which are so amazing and interesting in that community. And Will drew on that, or pointed to that, with this kitchen chair, which it can be seen around, you know, which is so commonplace, so resonant for people in Newfoundland. You know, that's reminds me of my nan's kitchen. So, and he installed, it's a steel piece installed out in off of Elliston shore in a very rocky, windswept, ocean swept space. And the existence of that chair, I'm watching that chair trying to weather the North Atlantic there. Yes. Brian Rick's photography, by the way, fantastic photographer on the peninsula. Just an incredible piece. So an Instagram account was started in the community to follow it. It lived on after the biennial, and with Will knowing full well and intentionally, with the intention that the North Atlantic would take that, it's going back to, you know, to nature.
Yeah. No, it's so. Yeah, he just nailed it with that.
And the color.
And it did exactly what we're talking about, which is it got the community really excited.
Yes. Yeah.
And they got it. Like, you didn't need to.
Yeah. But it's like, that's an artist. Like, there's so much integrity in that piece that it resonates with people, or they understand that that is really coming from community for them in a way. Yeah. So I think, without the artist, it would not be. What I'm really trying to say is, without the artists and those kind of ideas and ways of working, it would not be a successful event that it is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so poignant and visually stunning, and just such a win for the Biennale and for Will and for everyone, for the community.
I think, like, I don't want to obscure some of the blind spots of the biennial. I think there's certain ways in which some iterations have failed to acknowledge to the full extent Indigenous presence on the peninsula. There are problems with it. I think you have to look at the sort of notion of tourism and destination and the cycle of events. That is that a sustainable model for community and how that works? So I think there are problems with it, but it is an event I love. So I don't want to entirely obscure it.
Yeah. And I don't know, what would it even mean if there was like a perfect, like,
yes, true.
That doesn't even exist. So we could live with its imperfections. You also did, you co-created this with Riva Simcoe. Who's now in Winnipeg. Was she in Winnipeg then? No, this was in Kingston.
No, it was in Kingston. Riva at the time was doing her PhD at Queen's, and I was working at the Agnes Etherington Arts. And I think this was not long after I did Fedora's show, and it was a curatorial collective that we'd started called X-Curated. That name. But it was it was various interventions around the community with contemporary artists, and like including this Catherine Taves piece, the large billboards. And like, it was just, at the time we thought it was really ambitious, and we got public funding for it, and it was just really, we did a art bus tour, and it was entirely our collective. We had met through Modern Fuel Artist Run Center, so the Artist Run center movement, and that was a lot of just energy, and it was a real arts centers in Canada. I think of them, they're really important in the arts ecosystem, but partially because they're incubator spaces. They're spaces for people to be trying different projects and to be developing curatorial practices, administrative work, artistic practices in a way, in non-hierarchical ways, in community, empower it. So that the collective came out of our work. I was on the board of Modern Fuel, and Reva was on the board of Modern Fuel Arts Center, and we started the collective. And Jocelyn Purdy was at Union Gallery, joined the collective at that time, and we realized this project around Kingston. And it was Kingston, subsequent to this, developed a public art policy, expanded the conversation. And it's not because of this event, but the notion of public art as not being permanent bronzes. Kingston is the first capital of Canada. There's quite a bit of colonial loyalist Upper Canada notions, and real maintenance of colonial histories through bronzes, through the presence of Canada's first Prime Minister, John Macdonald. So there's a public art in that city was really understood in these sort of static and fixed ways, and we felt like this project pushed back against those, and we thought it was generative. So, but Kingston subsequently has public art policy and other things, and not, anyways, I shouldn't say subsequently, but yeah, we that was exciting for us. So Reva is now chief curator at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and a really, a powerful curatorial voice in our country.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and speaking to exactly what you were talking about, pointing the way and showing people what's possible.
Yeah.
And then,
and then what's possible isn't scary. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I guess the other tab I have is your current work, which is diverse, and here at the Grenfell Gallery, as I think I said, you are balancing a lot of needs in your role, and the gallery fulfills a lot of needs, and you could phrase it that way. So I don't know if there's a project or two you wanted to highlight. This is a beautiful collection. I highly recommend people heading to the page and clicking. There's a lot of great stuff on here.
Yeah, and I think these projects are done in some co-curated in collaboration, but I think that really it speaks to the vitality of our community, or our students. So, Grenfell Art Gallery is Memorial University's art gallery, but it's located on the West Coast because the School of Fine Arts, the art college or the art school in our province, is on the West Coast, and the gallery is under the umbrella of Memorial and under the umbrella of the School of Fine Arts, but it is the university's art gallery and cares for a large collection as well. But this, the amount of great work happening in our community, are really interesting artists working in ways that that's what the gallery, or these images are really references or draws on. I'm not sure if they're particular, Saltbox. I think one of the things, I don't know how to fit them in, but Call It Urban, I think there's a couple reasons, a couple practices or seeds for me in being here, and the work of Call It Urban was one of them. Colette had, when I was at Queen's, was traveling out to Western Newfoundland, had left London, and was doing talks across as they drove across, and presented at Queen's. And it was the only time I knew of Call It Urban. I'd been at Western. I knew of their work, and I just did the slideshow for the presentation. I set up and worked with them, and they were just so kind and generous and fun, and just the way they spoke and the energy and the images they had of what I didn't understand at the time, of your community, of Gillams, of Meadows, was so beautiful, and the sort of creative possibility in the space and the residencies that they call it started just spoke so powerfully of that potential. So Saltbox was initiated by Darcy Wilson, my colleague, who's a professor at the School of Fine Arts, and it's like a performance festival, and it draws on that Colette's history on the island, and some of the resonances of contemporary art and performance practices in relation to cultural traditions on the island. Recitation, spoken word, theater is a huge part of Newfoundland history, an important cultural component. I think it resonates, which is also School of Fine Arts is a theater program, so it resonates there. So Saltbox is kind of a through line, or one that I collaborate with now at this point on Darcy. She's really open and generous, but I always find it's really sort of can be quite, because it's performance work. Some of it can be quite gestational or in process, but Saltbox creates space for that in ways, and the students always it's one that connects with the students because they can, with performance, there's always this moment, and I think I can only imagine that this was the case with Colette's performances of like uncertainty initially, and the sort of tension, and it's scary. Well,
especially because she never rehearsed.
Yeah.
So it's really it's like, what's gonna go on? I don't know.
Oh, it's so catalytic, that tension, and just like the possibility. Yeah, it's just amazing. So Saltbox is one that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know. We should talk about Moonin too, and like in broad daylight, Tangine Martin O'Hara's.
Yeah,
Tangine was there at the art walk that we did in your performance, and that was one of the ways that she became aware of our residency program. So these things have such like a cyclical, reciprocal layering and building, that I think, I don't know, that I'm kind of proud of some of the momentum that we're building as a community, and some of the things that we're doing here that are important, I think.
Yeah. Well, I certainly know that, just like if I'm talking to people who know that I live in this town on the west coast of Newfoundland with 400 people in it, and then I start talking about what's going on with like art, they're like, wait, what? They expect something different, but there is a vitality and aliveness to the whole situation. Yeah.
And the sort of realness in the feedback, or the sort of community that I think cuts through or keeps us grounded too, and makes it more vital.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna stop.
That can also be discouraging.
Totally. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, in this, maybe we'll come back to the idea of care and nurturing, because this is the sword's edge, right? Is like putting something out there that doesn't actually get understood in the way that the artist intends, and receiving sometimes brutal feedback. I mean, I've certainly had this experience of just like brutal. And artists in general, I think I can make a sweeping statement, putting one's heart and soul into the work. Like, it's the air we breathe. And when it gets so kind of like, and in the, like, to me, this is like part of the care, is that the curator is sometimes there to pick up the pieces,
Yeah. Hopefully there.
Hopefully not like later.
or in pieces themselves.
Well, maybe we both. Yeah. So any final thoughts?
I think that's, if I reflect back on our initial, I think that's one of the reasons I bristled. I felt like in that role, there was a lack of care, or in the invocation of that curatorial title, I think there was a lack of understanding that there's care involved in that work, or there was a lack of care in embracing that title or using it in that way. So I think that's one of the ways, in my defense. Just
to hover on that for a second, I mean, I think this, you bring up something which is like, I think thinking about the person that we were talking about, like, that person had such a fixed agenda that in some ways erased even maybe the artists themselves, because the agenda took over. And so if I can extrapolate from what you're saying, is like part of the role of the curator is to, maybe you're drawing out what is important, but also there's like a fluidity in terms of the vision and how it's being presented.
Yeah.
Yes, there's an agenda, but like the evolution of the agenda is actually the key thing.
Yeah, and the connection or resonance with the artist and their practice and the work,
Yeah.
which seems
Hello.
oh yeah, but it seems so obvious, but sometimes it's not there in certain curatorial practices or in curatorial models. Like obviously, that notion of star architect or star art curator notions, like the overly thematicized or anyways practice projects. I think that's one of the failings or faults that a curator can fall into. They aren't careful, yeah, or that I can fall into if I'm not careful. I need to keep in mind. So. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure if I have anything else except to thank you. Yeah, this is lovely to have this chat and have this space. So thank you for doing this and asking me.
Yeah, so interesting. And I really appreciate your willingness to come on and to
Thank you.
share so honestly, and as always for your care, which is felt and communicated.
Yeah, and always and feels reciprocated in both in these conversations and in our ongoing collaborations and work together. But yeah, and generally in our community, I think we've identified some of the challenges, but I think there's a lot of that care and connection in our community. So yeah, I think we should have on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks.